Hello and welcome to Last Thursday in Privacy, the digital event series produced by Data Protection World Forum and sponsored this month by Microsoft. My name's Tom Howell from Data Protection World Forum, and I'll be anchoring a number of the sessions today. Please remember to join the conversation and engage with other attendees using the hashtag LTIP on Twitter and LinkedIn. Today, we're joined by attendees from all over the globe with companies including BBC, Bloomberg, Costco, and loads more. And we've got a full day of talks in store with over 20 sessions available to view live or on demand. The next session we have is GDPR Refresh. It's all about consent, which will be hosted by Vickie Guilloit, who is partner at Privacy Culture. Vickie has 20 years cross-sector experience in information security and data privacy, including investment banking, consumer goods, retail, and government. As a trusted advisor to organizations such as Unilever, the John Lewis Partnership, and Schroders, she drives behavioral change by developing strong networks across complex environments and embeds processes and practices that works for the people who need to use them. Over to you, Vickie.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Tom. And yes, what a lineup at Last Thursday in Privacy. Welcome again, everyone. In the next 30 minutes, we have a fantastic panel here for you. We have Jill Baehring from Pfizer. Jill is a privacy lead. Welcome to Jill. We also have Helen Woollett, who is DPO at The Body Shop. Welcome to Helen. And we also have Jéhanne, and apologies for my mispronunciation, Zkhiri, who's joining us from Didiomi and is a compliance specialist. So it's all about consent, and our panelists will help us go back to basics really on this topic. We'll be looking at the requirement for consent, of course, under the General Data Protection Regulation, and whether or not it's actually working in practice from both a company and an individual perspective. So I'm going to begin by asking you, Jill, can you remind us, please, what the GDPR actually says about consent?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's actually most important to remember that consent is only one of several legal grounds that the GDPR provides. And in my opinion, it's not really the best, because not only is it complicated, as we will hopefully get into in the session, but it can also be withdrawn. So I think, if possible, an organization should always try and find a different legal ground, because they're more reliable. They're like more sturdy over time. And good examples for that are the legal grounds of the performance of a contract with the individual, where consent is often used instead, but it's not actually necessary to use consent here. And the same goes for the legitimate interest ground, where organizations often go for consent even though there's a better option available. And I personally often work with special categories of personal data. So there we have like an advanced setup for obtaining consent, because Article 9 of the GDPR actually prohibits the processing of such data, and then it gives us exceptions. And I think even in these cases where you need to obtain explicit consent, not only the normal GDPR consent, but the explicit consent on the individual, is not actually my go-to legal ground, because I think, especially when it comes to the provision of healthcare, social security, and so on, the GDPR does allow us to process that data for these reasons. So in general, as you may be here, I'm not a huge fan of consent, but I think if an organization relies on consent, it should be done correctly. And if we look at the GDPR, it tells us the consent must be freely given, it must be specific, informed, and unambiguous. And even though you can say, yeah, of course, that's totally clear to me, I think it's much more difficult in practice than it sounds on paper. Because it means that a business really must make it possible for the individual to give their consent in this way, in this freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous way. And so as an organization, I have to make sure that my language, forms, my practices, they all reflect that. So in my opinion, consent is not really the easy option, even though on paper it looks quite straightforward.
Thanks, Jill. Interesting start there. Yeah, just sort of moving away from it at the beginning. And I'll ask the other panelists, please, if you have any builds on that point. Helen, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really, really interesting observation to see how those organizations handling special categories of data have to pay really close attention to consent. But then secondly, the use of consent in the pre-employment relationship seems really important these days. So whilst there is an exception for in the course of employment or in the performance of the employment contract, basically what I've seen out there in the broader world is that organizations are now actively using consent when they've collected data for the purposes of pre-employment relationships, and then going back to people a year even more later and saying, have you actually or do you actually agree to the keeping of this data? So they're very actively managing consents in that context. That's just one example. So I'll hand over to Jéhanne.
Thank you, Helen. I do really understand Jill's point when it comes to the complexity of using consent as a legal basis. Obviously, I'm working for a company who is only focusing on consent management. So that's really something that we do talk a lot with our partners, because it's something complex, but yet it can really be a useful basis, a clear basis, if it's correctly done, if obviously the consent is sufficiently explicited to be a word given. So I really like, I can't completely say that I do agree with the fact that the legitimate interest, for example, can be a better legal basis for all the data precision when it comes to the tracking technology, for example. In this case, consent is really a tool that can be used and is like really relevant in this case.
Thanks very much for that. And I'm just sort of picking up on three different points there. It's great that we've got those points of view. And Helen, I'm really glad that you brought in the employee perspective, because I think that's, so often forgotten in consent, isn't it? We so often focus on customer and consumer. But Jéhanne, you as you mentioned, you work for a consent management company. And clearly, as Jill talked about, organisations do find some difficulty trying to apply consent according to the GDPR. So, how would you kind of talk to that from your point of view?
A lot of information has been spread concerning consent collection, and it made it really complex. So that's something that I can understand. Between the protect boxes, for example, the cookie walls, or all the specific positive actions that are, we have DPAs in Europe, for example, who have really specific positions, and the guidances are not aligned all over Europe. So I really understand that it's a legal basis that might be hard to use and follow. Yet we do believe that consent will be an important KPI, will be a tool that will help be in touch with your customers when it comes from a brand, and it will, the compliance can be a tool by using consent to build trust. And this is something really important when it comes to your brand reputation, for example, because having a UI UX platform who is user-friendly, who is clear, is something that is possible. So it's really a question of how you want to see it, whether it's an annoyance or a business opportunity in real. And by using the consent, you will obviously see have lower consent rates. You will have data which will be worthing much more. But then you might also have something which is going to be much more relevant, much more precise. And the better you know your customers, the easiest you raise your revenue, and everything's going to come with it. So compliance can really be seen as a tool to better your brand reputation, and it cannot only be seen as an annoyance or an unfair legal basis, let's say. So you also have the point of collection across channels, because even, let's say, if we only talk about consent when it comes to online consent, you have all the unpleasant banners and not always compliant banners that we all know. But when it comes to offline consent, you also have some consent that you might want to get from shops, from phone contacts, for example, with customers. And today it's like really collected with paper. It's absolutely not operational in the sense that you have to retape it, push it back into all your tools, and it's really a way to lose track of the consent legally, but also like you lose time by doing it. So we at Didomi really think that consent is becoming one of the most important KPI in the years coming. We know that 2 years ago, marketers, for example, were really not aligned with DPOs because the compliance part was not something that made them happy. And today they really start to realize the benefit in terms of reputation for the brand. We see how all the rankings for the most lovable brand, the better reputation, all these rankings are really becoming targets for a lot of brands. So even if some brands are still reluctant to this transformation, we have seen that a lot of brands have just like nearly disappeared because of their reluctancy to the digital transition. And today we're kind of at the crossroads, and we do believe that there is a privacy transition and that most brands will be eager to get on it and follow it. So yeah, the consent can really be a tool, easy to handle and fluent when it comes to managing compliance.
Excellent. Thank you so much for unpacking that. I think it's really interesting to see it from that sort of key performance indicator, you know, a tool potentially for trust point of view. So I really want to bring that back first to you, Jill. You know, given that your opening point around, you know, actually we're going to move over and do it slightly differently. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really, really interesting perspective, and I totally agree that consent can build huge trust among your customers, your employees, basically all your stakeholders, if it's done correctly. What I wondered, and maybe you can enlighten that a little bit, Jeanne, is at least I often hear that there's something like a consent fatigue almost, because people are always asked to, you know, check a box, you have to consent to this, you have to consent to that. And in my experience, people, after a while, they just stop caring so much. They just tick a box, they don't read it anymore. And then I think, or at least my impression is that all these benefits that you have just highlighted correctly about consent can get lost. And how would you prevent that would be my follow-up question to you.
Well, I completely agree with this consent fatigue that you are mentioning. People are just really willing to just get rid of anything that doesn't let them really have access to what they are willing to. But then as soon as you have a strong brand image that people are like do trust your brand, they will trust you with the content of the banners. And once they have consented, if the consent management platform is really efficient, they will not have to face the choices again. So obviously when you have a really compliant banner, everything can be really fluid. When you have some like hesitantly compliant banners, it might appear again and the choice is not really taken into account. So I think really that the consent fatigue mostly comes from like not bad, but not perfectible banners and consent management platforms. Because when you have something like which is really fluid and user-friendly, it's not really like a problem. It doesn't raise this fatigue.
Excellent, thank you. Helen, I want to sort of come to you to pick up on the same point really, and from your experience. So perhaps starting with the external customer facing point of view, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think the really tricky part is, as Jéhanne was identifying, is how do you get consent right on the cookies and pixels and tags and so forth. And it's partly because the regulatory guidance does diverge, but it's also because there are a lot of different options open to companies. And what's really interesting, I think, is that a lot of companies are not doing anything on this. So, you know, so some companies are doing a lot. There's a great divergence in approaches across the spectrum of all organizations. And there's a lot of choice out there, despite the fact, as Jill said, that the provisions in that Article 32 that you're referring to are very specific about what's required in terms of consent, firstly. And secondly, you know, the provisions of GDPR apply to the Privacy Directive. So although the GDPR is very clear, the interpretation has been enormously diverse out there in the market. And I do think, I mean, I get very frustrated, and I do think everybody gets very frustrated at the amount of clicking you have to do to get through.
Definitely.
You know, so you're constantly, you know what you want as a consumer, you're constantly clicking, and then you get sick of clearing your cookies, you know, from your browser and clearing your cookies all the time. So I think it's a very common theme that everybody is kind of a bit frustrated by the way in which it works for cookies and pixels and tracking and so forth. But then separately, in relation to other consent functions, I think if the consent function doesn't work, whatever it might be, it's also incredibly frustrating if you're a user, because you just want to have clarity about what you're actually consenting to and why it's not working. So I know I didn't completely answer the question, but I think I was just trying to tap into what the other speakers had been referring to there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just such a big topic, isn't it? And it's, you know, it's great, it's fluid, it's organic, and you know, it's great that we've got different perspectives, and I know that that's going to be really helpful for the audience, because you're right, and we're picking up on the next point that we were going to address anyway, and that's, you know, it is having an impact on individuals, isn't it? And not necessarily positively. And Helen, you know, you started to talk about the HR perspective earlier on, the employee perspective as well. In what sort of impact do you think it's having on those individuals as well as
so I think it's very important to be aware that a lot of the HR context is about the for the purposes of the performance of the contract. So if you're going into an employment relationship, you're agreeing to terms and conditions, but organizations are steering away from using consent, because ultimately, unless they have to, they don't want to make that a dependency of signing up to contract, and they also don't want to be in a position where the employee tries to withdraw their consent as part of that. So it's very, very important. I think a lot of organizations have steered away from using consent as part of consent to processing as part of the employment relationship. But that said, there's all sorts of issues going into, if you need background checking, what do you do about that vis-a-vis criminal convictions and offences, and that varies by jurisdiction now. So there's those issues related to consent. There's also the issues on collection of data related to diversity and inclusion, and data that's necessary for the compliance of a legal obligation. And again, all of those obligations relate directly to member state law. So within the employment relationship, from what I've seen anyway, it's enormously complicated in terms of how much you're going to rely on consent versus how much you're going to rely on performance of the contract versus compliance with the legal obligation. So I assume that many people in the audience have looked at these specifically in relation to their own member state law. But certainly in the UK, it is very complicated. It's over 200 pages worth of law under the Data Protection Act.
Yeah.
And you also need a policy now. So in the UK, you actually need a policy in relation to handling the HR side of the equation.
Thank you so much for unpacking that, Helen. I think that would be, as I say, really interesting for the audience, as we always seem to focus on the consumer experience. Jill, can I just come across to you on a similar point? Do you have experience to share from an employee perspective as well?
I have to say I'm more working in the customer-facing area, and HR would be a different department. But generally speaking, I would agree with Helen that from my personal standpoint, I would try to avoid consent as a legal basis for processing as well in the HR world as much as possible. Obviously, it's not always possible. And where it's not possible, it should be done correctly in a way where, you know, not only the organization benefits from the processing of that data, but where you can also build a meaningful relationship with the employee or future employee or even previous employee.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jill. And Jen, can I come to you on that as well? I mean, from a consent management point of view, from an employee perspective, you know, given the points that Helen and Jill have raised, what have you seen?
Actually, I would completely join Jill and Helen when it comes to the internal data processing, because when it comes to rely on the consent internally, we know that the relationship between members of teams or between like the interaction that exists inside a company will ultimately nudge in a way or another. So I do agree with them. It's not really the best fit when it comes to this legal basis.
Excellent, thank you. So it would be really good to sort of give your thoughts and opinions, really, and I'll come to you, Jill, first of all on this. I know, again, to start with, you've got an approach in your organisation when it comes to consent, but you know, clearly we've just talked about opportunities potentially to improve. So what do you think organisations could actually do better in this space?
Well, I think generally speaking, there's a tendency to cut corners in obtaining the consent as a process. And I think from an organization's perspective, that's totally understandable. Because as we have discussed, on one side, we have, for example, the consent fatigue, where we constantly ask customers and stakeholders to agree to things, and they're just getting tired of it. On the other hand, the GDPR wants us to provide a certain granularity in the consent that we're asking. So we do actually need to ask very specific and different types of consents for different processings. And I think that is really a difficult balance to master, where on one hand, you don't want to bother your customer with consenting all the time. On the other hand, you also don't want to bother them with, you know, just obtaining something like a blanket consent or a consent that's not granular enough for them to actually provide some meaningful consent at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult, isn't it, as well, to balance it all with all of the other aspects of privacy that we need to be considered. Helen, any builds on what Jill's just talked about there?
Yeah, I think that with the way in which consent's going, it's really difficult to do it manually and off platform. So I would say it's incredibly dangerous if you don't have a process or a way of handling it for almost any organization nowadays. The days of seeing sort of paper forms that don't go anywhere or a paper process particularly in the light of COVID-19 and the fact that we're now having to operate so much online, I think that offline or consent processes off the side of a desk seem to be dangerous. And then secondly, how those processes are dovetailed into the rights to object and how they actually work at the back end is enormously important. And then finally, I would say transparency is the key, because if people think that it's not obvious what they're consenting to or not clear, and then they get some strange messages, I just think the anger factor is much greater than it used to be.
Yes.
Because there's so much more suspicion. So I think what's happened with GDPR is it's been very good because awareness has risen, but it's also meant that sometimes people get very suspicious and very mad very quickly. So I'll leave it at that. I won't try and expand on that.
I think that's great. I think, yeah, you make some excellent points and builds on Jill, yeah, both of you there. And that transparency point, as you say, is of course absolutely key. People are becoming more aware of their individual rights and what they should expect. So you're right, you know, the anger factor is rising because their expectations are getting higher. So therefore, organisations arguably should be responding accordingly. Jéhanne, you know, what are your thoughts on that? What could we all start doing a bit better to be more transparent and clearer in the space?
Again, I really think that it has to be linked to the high emotional, the customers, in the case of customers relationship, the relation, like the highly emotional relation that might exist with a brand, can be raised thanks to transparency, thanks to explicit communication. And again, when it's done with a in a user-friendly way, it really can absorb all the difficulties and anger that were mentioned. But it is something that has to be done consciously, and it has to be built like with the legal and marketing teams working together, beside all the other teams, obviously. But it's really something that is important to build a strong brand image and to be compliant at the same time, and to facilitate the relationship with the customers and keep on having knowledge about them. So again, I agree with Helen and Jill, because it's something really important to do, and it has to be done genuinely with all the help possible.
Excellent, great points from all of you there. So we've got a few questions in the bank. So I think what we'll do is we'll pop over to the Q&A, have a look at what we've got, and see how far we get through with answering those. So what I'll do is I'll just read them out, and feel free, any of you, to pick up and jump in. Hello, Sana from Belgium. I'm wondering about contact tracing in the COVID situation. In some situations, our information is shared even without our consent. I know this is a public health issue, therefore rules could be circumvented. Do you think it would be any problem for the future? How can we be sure that our data will be deleted later? I think I might actually ask Helen to pick up on that one, as it was something that you raised before.
Yeah, it's a pretty big discussion / question, but I think ultimately with that aspect of data privacy, it's very important that the individuals are aware of what they're signing up to by way of apps. Secondly, they understand and exercise their rights if they're worried. Yeah. And thirdly, just be as informed as possible, because I know that countries are all varying on this. And in some countries, they've made a big effort not to actually collect and store personal information off device, i.e. on servers. So I'm kind of thinking of Germany here. So I know that Jill might want to comment further on this, but I think the best defense is to really understand what you're doing as an individual when you either sign up to apps or sign up to contact tracing information.
Oh, that's a really good point, Helen, isn't it? You know, the onus is coming back to us, isn't it, to be self-aware in this as well. Jill, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really, really interesting question. So thank you for that. And I think so. I'm thinking about two scenarios where that was recently a discussion in Germany. One, of course, with the corona tracing app that we have. And even though many Germans are still quite critical of the app, I do think that the government and the parties involved that developed the app, they really took into account the voices from civil society, about how can we really build an app that's privacy preserving. I still know many privacy professionals who are very, very critical of this app, even particularly, but I think it is probably done the best way it can be done at the moment. And the second scenario would be we have contact tracing requirements in Germany right now where, for example, when you go to a restaurant, you need to put down your name and your address and your telephone number so you can be tracked later in case there's a corona case. And in some instances, the police has been using these lists to ask for witnesses and witness statements if there was a crime nearby. And even though I find it very understandable from a police point of view that if this data is available, it should be used for something like resolving a crime, I think that's really about expectation management. Because if you don't manage these expectations correctly and, for example, put down in this contact tracing form something like, we will only use this data in case there's a corona case and your data will otherwise be destroyed after 2 weeks or whatever, and then it is used for other reasons, I think this is a fatal mistake, because when doing something like contact tracing, there's always possibilities to cheat. So you do want to build a trusting relationship with the parties involved and obviously with the people who need to put down their private information. So I think if just the communication were better, a lot of these problems wouldn't even exist.
Excellent, thanks, Jill. Yeah, it's back to being, very explicit and very transparent, isn't it, as we've been talking about. I'll move to the next question now, because we have got a few more that have come in since. So in healthcare, can you really use consent which requires freely and willingly given, whereas it might be more realistic to say you have to share and process based on the contract to treat or to protect the data subject? Does anybody want to pick up on that one first?
I'll start and then maybe Jill wants to follow. I have just noticed that the healthcare organisations in the UK use consent all the time. So I think it's a fact of life. I don't work in the healthcare industry, but it's a standard practice. And certainly for hospitals, it's a common practice. For GPs, it's a different process, general practitioners. And for consultants, it's a different process. But the thing about the healthcare profession is that all of these people are often operating as individual professional businesses, and they're contracted to hospitals, and therefore you have this relationship which needs to be preserved, the relationship of confidentiality and patient relationship. So it's not a simple thing. So I'll hand it over to Jill to see what you have to say.
Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very difficult, and I would really, unfortunately, give you a lawyery answer by saying it depends. It really depends on the circumstance. So generally speaking, as I have said earlier, I would try to avoid consent, not because I'm not a fan of people consenting, but because I think there are more reliable options that are also more clear for everyone. What the consequences are. And obviously there are some instances where you do need consent. For example, if you're working with a patient and the patient wants to put their story out or something like that. So it's absolutely crucial to have good consent practices there. But as I have said, I do think it really depends on the very individual project that the data is processed in.
Thank you, really helpful answer, both of you. Okay, so we're back to employees now. So considering employees' consent and when there is no other valid legal ground, do you have any suggestions or best practices to ensure that such consent is freely given? Does anybody want to pick up on that one? Helen, do you want to take the employee perspective?
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a really tough one. I suppose what I'll do is I'll use an example of monitoring. So it's a very specific example, but in the case of the UK and the extent to which an organisation needs to monitor employees' activities. So the situation is that a lot of organisations will either use consent or use notice and not consent. However, in some sectors, it's actually absolutely necessary to, for example, record telephone calls or in some cases monitor employees' activities for the purposes of legal obligations. But I think in a lot of these sectors, it's very, very difficult to rely on consent. So it's a very, very case-by-case basis, I would say, as to whether you can or can't practically do that.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks a lot for unpacking that, Helen. I'll pop to the next question unless anybody wanted to build on that. Okay, so the next one is, can the panelists please address the issue of compliance with GDPR Article 8, specifically how to obtain consent from the authorised holder of parental responsibility and enabling parents to grant, deny or revoke consent on behalf of a child? It's an interesting one. Any thoughts? We can always move to the next one and come back.
It's quite a tough one. Sorry, does somebody want to do that, handle that?
Yeah, I would say that the only viable option is to really document everything fiercely and be very sure that the consent not only of the parent is given, but obviously that the consent of the parent also reflects the minor's wishes. And I really think it's all about documentation there.
Exactly, and also it's about identification. So the issue that often crops up is that, is the parent really the parent? Is the guardian really the guardian? So is it an appropriate, does the person have authority, is the first question. But also in disputes between parents, this is the real problem. And there are, like a lot of these things, there are existing systems and processes in place to deal with that in certain sectors. But now that the GDPR has opened up to Article 8, it's become much more of a live thing for information society services. But I'm not in that sector, thankfully.
Thank you both for that. And this one is actually a question that's initially for you, Jill. You mentioned the stricter consent laws in Germany and some exceptions around them. We're a B2B business entering the German market and cannot rely on legitimate interests for cold outreach as we can in the UK. What advice or guidance would you give to someone entering the German B2B market?
So while I'm not specifically a B2B marketing expert, I hear this complaint a lot from foreign companies trying to enter the German market. And I think it's a very challenging market, not only because of that, but because the Germans are, in my opinion, inherently a little bit conservative. They like to use the things that are well established and tried out, and sometimes are not so adventurous with new products or services. And my advice would be to rely on existing relationships, try the networking round and just, you know, offer appealing product and service, and also appealing communication, so that you don't have to approach people eternally, but hopefully in the end you will be approached as well.
Thanks a lot, Jill. The next one that's come in is more of a statement, but I guess we'll read it out and just see if you're in agreement or you've got any builds on it. Consent is not okay in HR relations with certain exceptions, as is the case of GPS tracking of company cars, for example. There are some cases where consent cannot be relied on. Take a warehouse and the use of a CCTV system. In this case, the legal basis should be the law and not consent, because if the employee doesn't consent to the processing of its image, you either lose or they're being forced to work knowing they are being video surveyed. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the answers to that is in the UK Data Protection Act, if you're in the UK, that is, and there are extensive provisions related to health and safety. So, for example, if it's on private premises and it's CCTV and it's for health and safety purposes, then I think a lot of local laws are providing for important provisions concerning consent. Do any of the others want to comment on that one?
Okay, let's go to the next one. So it's back to healthcare again. What do you use when marketing to patients and why?
I would actually pick that up and say marketing with patients or providing direct marketing to patients, I find that very, very difficult, because again, it's about the expectation management. Even if you have a pre-existing relationship with the patient, they may not want to be confronted all the time with, you know, aspects of their disease. And this is the only thing that you can relate to in direct marketing if you have a pre-existing relationship, you know, in that you offer them information that is related to what they have been interested in before. So in that sense, I would actually say direct marketing to patients is an area where I would heavily rely on very specific, very informed consent, as Jéhanne has described earlier, because this is an area where you do not want to violate any trust and want to be a very, very reliable partner in this relationship with the patient.
I think that the EU differs massively from the US on this one, by the way.
Good point.
Yeah, so on medical data, there have been some celebrated indirect marketing breaches in the US.
That's a really, really, really good point to pick up on. But back to the GDPR now. In what sense do you believe the GDPR could be improved when it comes to consent? Or do you think the improve? Perhaps it should be that. Do you think? Do you think it's back to the regulation, Jill?
Yeah, I actually think that's a good question. And earlier I have mentioned that the granularity of consent can sometimes be a problem, not because organizations don't want to provide it, but if they do provide it, they just don't get the consent they need anymore for their relationship with the customers because of this consent fatigue. So in that sense, if there were a GDPR revision, I would say that there should just be a revision of the best practices, what works, what does not work, and really take into account the individual's perspective on these practices to find a common ground that works for both sides, essentially.
Yeah, look, on this point specifically, I think that it's the Irish DPC who did quite a huge job by just going through like numerous websites and check how it was done on the website, how the recommendations were applied, and then issued some more specific recommendations. So as was saying Jill, it might be useful to see how the GDPR has been understood and then how it's applied, and then be more specific on some points if needed, or just build over the experience and build some more specific recommendations, so maybe all the DPAs can get aligned and So we have something maybe more aligned and technical and practical and pedagogical for users.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that firstly, codes of conduct are being done on this. So the ICO is looking at codes. And then secondly, I think there's been an enormous change in the internet and advertising industry in response to the provisions in the GDPR. However, I think this granular consent thing is a real issue for consumers, for individuals, you know. So how do you manage it? How do you understand it? How do you manage all your relationships? And if there's one area I'd look at is that whole way of it working.
Thanks so much, Helen. And I can see Tom, our anchor, has appeared in the window, which means that it's time to wrap up. But thank you so much to all of you. I think it was such a great and rich discussion because you had so different points of view to bring to the table. So I think our audience would really benefit from that, and some great questions coming in from them as well. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope the audience did too. And back to Tom.
Thank you very much, Vickie. And I'd like to say a fantastic job to you for hosting that and getting through the audience questions. We really appreciate it. So next up, we've got two more fascinating discussions. We've got Privacy Made Positive, Measuring the Impact, where you can learn how to shape the future of privacy, and Protecting Democracy, how the UK Parliament is combating online attacks on elections. And if you're not able to watch any of them live, they will be available on demand for you. So we hope you can join us there. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye.